Hi. So this is chapter 2, video 2. We're going to continue our discussion about evolution. One of the things that is probably pretty obvious is that science is tough. I mean, it's complex, it's difficult to understand. And one of the things that means is that there are a lot of misconceptions in general about science. When you add to that the fact, as I've said before, that for a whole host of reasons, as I discussed in part 1 of this video, we don't teach evolution very well. The misconceptions about evolution are in many ways even more extreme than they are about science in general. So in this video, I just want to touch on some of those misconceptions and hopefully clear them up. In part 1, I discussed the creationism versus evolution debate and looked at the historical roots of it. At the core of the creation-evolution debate is this concern by creationists, not all of them, but many creationists, that science in general, and evolution in particular, is looking to disprove the existence of God, that science wants to replace religion. And it's important to understand that there is a clear difference between science and religion. And in many ways, science is completely moot on that question of whether or not God exists. And the difference, that clear difference, that clear dividing line between science and religion is this. As I said in, I think, the introductory video, science is interested in looking at how the world works and explaining the way the world works in natural ways. We look for natural forces to explain all manner of things that we see functioning in the world around us. And what that means is that for a scientist, uncertainty is okay. Because for the scientist, what he or she does is they look at a problem, or they look at a question, or they look at something in the natural world, and they try to understand it, and they keep working until they get to a point where they don't understand it. That they get to a point where like, what's going on here? For the scientist, that is the key point, because that's where the scientist wants to focus their efforts of research and experimentation to try to answer that question of, okay, here's this gray area, here's this thing I don't understand. I want to understand it. I want to figure out what natural forces are making this process happen. By comparison, in religion, at some point, what separates religion from science, and what is ultimately the primary dividing line between science and religion, is that where those scientists, with their uncertainty, are excited because that's an opportunity to learn more and to explain more through natural forces. In religion, when we have uncertainty, we rely upon a supernatural explanation. If something can't be explained, then it must be because of an all-powerful being, a god or gods, who or whatever that deity may be, is behind that unknown thing. So at a certain point, religion clearly differentiates itself from science because science cannot use supernatural explanations for things. Scientists can certainly say, I don't know. We can't answer that question. One of the important things to also understand about science is science is supposed to be open-minded. And what I mean by that is science is based on the idea that everything that we know is based on the information that we have right now. But we have to accept the possibility that tomorrow, or a week from now, or a year from now, or 1,000 years from now, we will learn something that will completely change how we look at the world. It's happened many times before, and it's likely to happen in the future. And that's what science does. In religion, by comparison, as I said, uncertainty is answered with a supernatural explanation, which is inherently unscientific. So with that in mind, let's turn to evolution. And just a couple of specific misconceptions. One of the important misconceptions is about Charles Darwin himself. It is widely accepted that Charles Darwin came up with evolution, or he thought up evolution. But in fact, Charles Darwin didn't. The principles of evolution predate Darwin by at least 100 years. But what Darwin did do is he came up with a mechanism for evolution. He was the first person to recognize the influence that the natural environment, what he called natural selection, has in being a driver of evolutionary change. He wasn't the only person to come to that conclusion. About 20 years later, a man named Alfred Wallace, working in Asia, independently came up with the same observations of his own, but because Darwin had come up with them first, we know Charles Darwin, and most people don't know very much about Wallace. So Darwin's unique contribution is not evolution itself, but the mechanism, one of the mechanisms by which evolution occurs, or by which evolution is driven. A couple other misconceptions that are kind of related specifically to the creationism and evolution debate. You will often hear people who are suspect or hostile to evolution say things like, well, evolution says that we evolved from monkeys. And if I evolved from a monkey, why are there still monkeys? Or they'll say, evolution says that we evolved from chimps. But if I evolved from a chimpanzee, why are there still chimpanzees? The thing is, those questions are foolish. Because, number one, that's not what evolution says. I'll explain that in a minute. But more importantly, it's because it's sort of a false comparison. It's the equivalent of saying, hey, I descended from my parents, so why do I still have parents? So those types of questions are kind of silly. But more importantly, evolution does not say that humans evolved from monkeys. Evolution does not say that humans evolved from chimpanzees. To simplify things, I'll focus on chimpanzees, but the answer is basically the same for monkeys. What evolution does say is that humans and chimpanzees are very closely related. Outside of the human species, chimpanzees are the animals that we're most closely related to. There are 4 great ape species on this planet. Humans are one of them, chimpanzees are another, gorillas are the third, and orangutans are the fourth. And humans and chimpanzees are very closely related. But what we know is that that relationship is one that goes back to about 8 million years. Somewhere between 8 to 10 million years ago, there was a species, and that species, whatever it was neither human nor was it chimpanzee, but that species split into 2 groups, and one of those groups ultimately evolved into modern humans, and one of those groups ultimately evolved into modern chimpanzees. But we certainly did not evolve from chimpanzees. Another important misconception, and something that I hope you will give some thought to, is people say that you will hear people criticize evolution by saying, well, evolution is just a theory, and a scientist can't tell you that evolution is true. Again, that criticism is sort of based on flawed logic. The problem is how we use words. You and I may use the word theory in very casual ways in everyday conversation. I got a theory about what my boss is going to do for the schedule next week. I have a theory about how the football game is going to turn out. I have a theory about why my brother-in-law doesn't like chocolate, whatever it may be. And really what that represents when we use theory like in that context is pretty much a guess. We have a general idea. But when we say that something is a theory in science, we mean something far more profound. Because what we mean is that we had this thing that used to be an idea, a hypothesis. And then we started testing that hypothesis and we started getting data. And the data that we got supported the hypothesis. So we came up with more hypotheses and we came up with more experiments and we got more data. And over time, this increasing body of evidence, empirical, observable, measurable evidence comes along, and it all supports this original idea. And that's what a theory is. It's an idea that has been supported by so much evidence, so much information, that it is considered to be, for all intents and purposes, accurate, and for all intents and purposes to be true. Having said that, when a person makes the claim that a scientist can't tell you that evolution is true, in a sense, they're right, in the purest sense of the word. And it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. In science, we are supposed to be open-minded. We only know what we know because of the information that we have right now. And we have to accept the possibility that somewhere along the way, in 10, 50, 100, 1,000 years, something will change the way we think. So we can't say that anything is true. Gravity is not true. Germ theory is not true. The science that allows you to turn on your lights every day when you flick a light switch, it's not true. Simply because the idea of truth in science is too absolute. As I say, for all intents and purposes, we operate as if it's true. We certainly hope it is, based on, as I said in the first video, agriculture and medicine and forensic science and all the other disciplines that depend upon evolutionary theory. But simply for semantic reasons, simply because of the way we use words, we can't say that evolution is true because it's too absolute. We have to accept that someday more information that we learn may completely turn evolution on its head. And then finally, I want to talk to you about the phrase survival of the fittest. A lot of people use the phrase survival of the fittest as a sort of shorthand definition for what evolution is. And it's one of those phrases that, similar to theory, it's just kind of gotten embraced by our common day-to-day language, and people think we are saying something useful when we say survival of the fittest. Here's the thing. Survival of the fittest is actually a terrible definition of evolution. It was not a phrase that Charles Darwin came up with. It was actually came up with by a man named Herbert Spencer. We'll talk a little bit about Herbert Spencer in a couple of weeks. But there's a fundamental problem. There are a couple of fundamental problems with this idea of survival of the fittest. The very first problem is the idea of survival. Nothing survives. Everything dies. One way, shape, or another, everything will ultimately die. But more importantly is this idea of fittest. The problem with fittest is it implies one, either the fastest or the strongest or the smartest. But if you look around the world, how many humans are there on the planet right now? There are over 7 billion people on the planet. You're telling me all of them are the fittest? If you look in any species, there are far more individuals in any species that you would expect to be classified as the fittest. And the problem is what fit, or specifically what fitness means, biologically speaking. I'm going to say something right now that I suspect may shock some of you. And what I'm going to say is that I suspect that most of you in this class, biologically speaking, have a fitness of 0. You may go to the gym every day. You may run marathons. You may have a great diet. You may do all of those things so that you're physically fit, but biologically speaking, your fitness is 0. I, on the other hand, I know that I have fitness. Well, how do I know that? What separates me from most of you? And the one thing that, again, I suspect separates me from most of you is that I have children. Biologically speaking, fitness is all about reproductive success. How successful you are reproducing and passing your genes on to the next generation. You could be the smartest, the fastest, the strongest, the best looking member of your species, and you step off a curb and get hit by a bus before you have a chance to reproduce, and your fitness is 0. You can be slow, ugly, dumb, but you just happen to talk a good game, and you reproduce a lot, and your fitness is sky high. So we need to understand that in science, these terms that we use, theory, fitness, natural selection, other terms that you're going to come across in the chapter, mutation, alleles. These are very specific terms, and they're very important, and they have very precise definitions. And it's very easy for misconceptions about those definitions to sidetrack the conversation and to allow misconceptions about evolution as a whole to creep in. This will continue in video number 3, part number 3, where I will provide a couple of examples of how evolution through natural selection works. Have a nice day.